At approximately 2:10 a.m. on April 7, 2001, 19-year-old Timothy C. Thomas, an unarmed black male, was shot and killed by Cincinnati police officer Stephen Roach, a 27-year-old white male, in the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood of Cincinnati, Ohio. The incident, brief in duration but broad in consequence, occurred in a narrow alleyway between Republic Street and 13th Street. The city was in a state of tension preceding the event, marked by a rising number of police-involved deaths of black males in the months leading up to the shooting. Timothy Thomas had accumulated 14 outstanding warrants, most of which were non-violent misdemeanors, including traffic violations and failure to appear in court. According to police records, a special detail had been deployed in Over-the-Rhine, a predominantly black, low-income neighborhood, with the aim of apprehending individuals with outstanding warrants as part of an ongoing crackdown on petty crime. Officer Stephen Roach, a relatively new addition to the Cincinnati Police Division Street Detail, was working in plain clothes that night and operating under a directive to pursue individuals with open warrants. At 2 a.m., Thomas was observed exiting a nightclub on Main Street. Upon noticing plainclothes officers approaching, he reportedly fled on foot. The pursuit was brief but aggressive. Roach followed Thomas into the alley and, within seconds, drew and discharged his service weapon. Thomas was struck once in the chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Roach later claimed that during the chase, Thomas reached for his waistband, leading Roach to fear that the suspect was armed. No weapon was found on or near Thomas's body. The city's forensic unit confirmed that Thomas was not carrying any firearm, knife, or blunt instrument at the time of his death. The autopsy concluded that the bullet entered the chest cavity at close range and severed a major artery, leading to rapid blood loss and death within minutes. Witnesses in adjacent buildings reported hearing a single gunshot followed by shouting, but due to the late hour, visual confirmation of the shooting was not obtained by civilians. Roach immediately radioed for assistance. Backup arrived within 4 minutes, and the area was cordoned off as a crime scene. Initial handling of the site drew scrutiny, as several officers failed to wear gloves while handling evidence, and no photographs were taken of Roach's weapon prior to it being secured. Thomas's death marked the 15th police-involved death of a black male in Cincinnati since 1995, a statistic that had already sparked quiet but persistent unrest in local black communities. Unlike previous incidents, this killing had occurred under clear circumstances. An unarmed teenager was shot in the chest during a foot pursuit for nonviolent offenses. Timothy C. Thomas was born on July 10, 1981, in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was a high school dropout but had recently spoken of enrolling in a GED program. He was employed part-time at a local auto garage. Friends and family described him as quiet, cautious around police, and particularly wary of confrontations with law enforcement. His mother, Angela Leisure, was awakened by a phone call at 3:45 a.m. notifying her of her son's death. She would become a central figure in the public response that followed. By mid-morning on April 7, word of the shooting had spread through Over-the-Rhine. Within hours, a crowd of several dozen gathered near the scene. Tensions began to escalate as local media arrived and early reports identified Roach as the officer involved. Demonstrators chanted for justice, some holding photographs of Thomas. The police division issued a brief statement confirming the shooting and promising a full internal review. This would mark the beginning of a prolonged civic crisis in Cincinnati, as the circumstances of Timothy Thomas's death would ignite not only a departmental inquiry but also mass public demonstrations and, eventually, a citywide state of emergency. The death was no longer a local tragedy. It was becoming a national inflection point. In the hours following the shooting, tensions in Cincinnati escalated with visible speed. By the afternoon of April 7, 2001, the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood had become a locus of anger, grief, and confusion. The police division's limited statement, that an officer had fired upon a fleeing suspect who appeared to be reaching for a weapon, did little to quell rising distrust. Residents, already familiar with a pattern of lethal force against black men, questioned the necessity of the shooting and the truthfulness of the official narrative. Within 24 hours, Cincinnati Police Chief Thomas Stryker Jr. announced that Officer Stephen Roach had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The shooting would also be reviewed by the city's Citizen Complaint Authority and the Hamilton County Prosecutor's Office. Roach, through his legal counsel, reiterated his belief that Thomas was armed and posed an immediate threat. No charges were filed at that time. Autopsy results, released on April 8, confirmed that Thomas had been unarmed. The bullet had entered the center of his chest at a downward angle, suggesting that he may have been crouching or turning at the moment of impact. Toxicology screens showed no presence of alcohol or narcotics in his system. These findings further undermined Roach's claim that Thomas had made a threatening gesture. The police division's pursuit policy also came under scrutiny. Internal documents revealed that Thomas was being sought on misdemeanor warrants, the majority of which were traffic-related, including a citation for driving without a seatbelt. Critics argued that deadly force was in no way justified in this context. Civil rights attorneys and local activists began organizing public forums and demanding an independent inquiry into the practices of the Cincinnati Police Division. On April 9, community members gathered at the Tried Stone Baptist Church for a vigil and strategy meeting. Local NAACP leaders called for transparency, an expedited investigation, and criminal charges against Roach. Reverend Damon Lynch III, a key figure in the Cincinnati black community, urged young people to protest peacefully, but acknowledged a righteous fury building among residents. Meanwhile, internal police documents were leaked to local media, indicating that Roach had previously been cited for questionable conduct during foot chases. One incident involved the unlawful detention of a juvenile, another cited poor judgment during a traffic stop. These revelations, though not widely publicized outside Cincinnati at the time, fueled further distrust. The stage was now set for public confrontation. The city braced itself. On April 9, 2001, demonstrations turned to unrest. What began as a peaceful march through downtown Cincinnati, organized by local pastors and community activists, was soon overtaken by younger residents, many of whom felt long excluded from institutional reform efforts. The crowd, estimated at over 500, moved from City Hall toward District 1 Police Headquarters. Tensions reached a tipping point when protesters confronted officers stationed in riot gear. By 5 p.m., isolated confrontations had erupted, rocks were thrown, windows broken. As night fell, looting began in select storefronts in Over the Rhine and the West End. Police deployed pepper spray and beanbag rounds to disperse crowds. 2 officers were reported injured, several civilians were arrested. Local officials hesitated to classify the events as a riot, but media coverage quickly adopted that term. April 10 saw a deepening of the unrest. Over the next 48 hours, the city experienced sustained disorder. Dozens of businesses were vandalized. Fires were set. Police vehicles were struck by bricks and bottles. The Cincinnati Police Division increased its presence, activating all available personnel. Helicopters circled the skies above downtown, broadcasting real-time footage of streets overrun by demonstrators. Mayor Charles Lucan issued a statement on April 11, declaring a state of emergency and announcing a citywide curfew effective 8 p.m. The curfew applied to all residents under age 18 and was later expanded to include all citizens. Violators faced immediate arrest. The city requested assistance from the Ohio State Highway Patrol, and National Guard units were placed on standby, though never deployed. Over the 5-day period from April 9 to April 13, more than 800 arrests were made. Property damage exceeded $3.6 million. 57 people were injured, including over a dozen law enforcement personnel. The city had not experienced unrest of this scale since the 1968 riots following Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Civil rights leaders, while denouncing the violence, attributed the scale of the uprising to accumulated grievances. The shooting of Timothy Thomas had not been an isolated incident, it was the final expression of a long-standing fracture between the black community and the Cincinnati Police Division. Between 1995 and 2001, 15 black males had died in encounters with police. No officers had been indicted. Timothy Thomas's funeral, held on April 14 at New Prospect Baptist Church, was attended by over 1,500 mourners. Reverend Lynch delivered the eulogy, urging calm but demanding justice. Thomas's mother, Angela Leisure, stood beside an open casket and quietly repeated, "He was unarmed. He was just a boy." In the aftermath of the civil unrest that paralyzed Cincinnati for nearly a week, pressure mounted on city and state officials to demonstrate accountability. On April 16, 2001, Hamilton County Prosecutor Mike Allen convened a grand jury to determine whether Officer Stephen Roach would face criminal charges in the fatal shooting of Timothy Thomas. The grand jury, composed of 9 white members and 3 black members, was presented with forensic reports, dash-cam recordings of events prior to the foot chase, and testimony from multiple officers and civilians. On April 18, 2001, after 2 days of deliberations, the grand jury returned an indictment against Roach, not for murder, but for 2 misdemeanor charges, negligent homicide and obstructing official business. Negligent homicide carried a maximum penalty of 180 days in jail and a $1,000 fine. The obstruction charge alleged that Roach failed to accurately report the circumstances of the shooting in his initial statement. The announcement of the indictment produced a muted but cautious response from the public. Some community leaders welcomed the charges as a first step toward accountability. Others criticized the limited scope, arguing that a misdemeanor indictment for a fatal shooting reinforced the very inequities at the heart of the protests. Prosecutor Allen defended the decision, stating that the evidence failed to establish intent but clearly showed a reckless disregard for life. Officer Roach, through his legal counsel Merlin Shiverdecker, pleaded not guilty and waived his right to a jury trial, opting instead for a bench trial before Municipal Court Judge Ralph E. Winkler. This strategic move eliminated the uncertainty of a jury verdict in a racially and emotionally charged case. Roach remained free on bond pending trial. During the trial, which began on June 5, 2001, the prosecution focused on inconsistencies in Roach's account. Initially, Roach had claimed Thomas made a movement toward his waistband. Later statements softened that claim, describing Thomas as turning suddenly or stumbling. Forensic evidence, including the downward angle of the fatal bullet and absence of weapon, contradicted the notion of an armed threat. The defense argued that the officer acted within the bounds of his training under stressful conditions. Roach testified in his own defense, stating he believed Thomas was reaching for a gun and that he feared for his life. He also said the narrow alley's limited visibility and adrenaline from the chase contributed to his split-second decision. No civilian eyewitnesses saw the shooting directly. Expert testimony from a police use of force instructor revealed that Roach had deviated from standard protocol by not waiting for backup in a low-visibility environment. However, the expert stopped short of labeling the action criminally negligent. On June 22, 2001, Judge Winkler issued his verdict, not guilty on both charges. He stated that while Roach's actions demonstrated poor judgment and an unnecessary rush to use force, the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that his behavior met the threshold for criminal negligence or intentional obstruction. Winkler criticized the Cincinnati Police Division's training and communication protocols but concluded that Roach's fear, though unfounded, was genuine. The courtroom fell silent. Thomas's family exited without comment. Outside, demonstrators gathered but remained peaceful. There were no renewed riots, but the city's wounds were far from healed. The acquittal of Officer Stephen Roach on June 22, 2001, confirmed what many Cincinnati residents, particularly in the black community, had long believed: the justice system would not hold police officers accountable for the deaths of unarmed civilians. Though the streets remained calm in the immediate aftermath, the city entered a period of profound distrust, civic division, and organized resistance. Public statements poured in over the following days. The Cincinnati Black United Front, led by Reverend Damon Lynch III, denounced the verdict as a miscarriage of justice cloaked in legality. The NAACP echoed these sentiments, releasing a national statement asserting that Cincinnati has proven itself unable to police itself. Activists emphasized the systemic nature of the problem, citing not just the Thomas case, but a pattern of disproportionate stops, searches, and use of force against black residents. On June 25, a coalition of civil rights groups organized a citywide forum titled "The Cost of Injustice." Held at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, the event brought together clergy, attorneys, educators, and students. Speakers included Angela Leisure, mother of Timothy Thomas, who stated, "They killed my son twice, once in the alley, and once again in court." The emotional resonance of her words helped galvanize new organizing efforts. Community leaders began calling for a boycott of downtown Cincinnati businesses, particularly those believed to have benefited from city contracts while remaining silent during the unrest. This economic boycott, known as the blackout, gained traction quickly. By July 2001, more than 50 local businesses reported revenue losses. Cultural events, including performances and conventions, were canceled in solidarity or due to pressure from civil rights groups. The boycott remained in effect for nearly 2 years and is credited with helping bring national attention to the city's policing issues. Several entertainers, including Bill Cosby and Wynton Marsalis, refused to perform in Cincinnati during that period. Local organizers framed the movement as both a moral protest and a strategic assertion of economic influence. In parallel, the federal government took notice. On April 12, 2001, just days after the unrest, U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft ordered the Department of Justice, DOJ, to conduct a civil rights investigation into the Cincinnati Police Division. By the fall of 2001, DOJ officials had interviewed more than 300 residents, reviewed thousands of pages of departmental records, and compiled a report indicating consistent patterns of excessive force, racial profiling, and inadequate disciplinary mechanisms. Cincinnati's leadership, facing lawsuits and the threat of a federal consent decree, entered negotiations with DOJ officials and local civil rights attorneys. The result would become one of the nation's first major, collaborative agreements, between a city, its police department, and its citizens, a model that would influence police reform initiatives in other U.S. cities in years to come. But in the months immediately following Timothy Thomas's death, the city remained fractured. The conversation had moved beyond one officer and one victim. What remained was the deep question of how a city heals when trust in its institutions has eroded past the breaking point. In the months after Timothy Thomas's death and the subsequent civil unrest, Cincinnati's civic and legal frameworks began a slow, pressured transformation. The most significant development came in the form of the April 2002 Collaborative Agreement, a binding accord between the City of Cincinnati, the Cincinnati Police Department, CPD, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Cincinnati Black United Front, under oversight from the U.S. Department of Justice. The collaborative agreement emerged after extended negotiations prompted by the DOJ's civil rights investigation. The DOJ concluded that the CPD had engaged in a pattern or practice of excessive force and racial bias. Though no formal consent decree was issued, owing to voluntary city cooperation, the agreement effectively functioned as a federal mandate for reform. Key provisions included the establishment of an independent citizen complaint authority, CCA, with subpoena power to investigate allegations of police misconduct. The agreement also required the implementation of community problem-oriented policing, CPOP, a model that emphasized partnerships between officers and residents in identifying and resolving neighborhood safety concerns. A separate but related federal memorandum of agreement required the CPD to overhaul its use of force policy, strengthen training on de-escalation techniques, and improve data collection on officer behavior. Officers would now be required to report all uses of force, and a new early intervention system was developed to identify problematic behavior patterns. In response to these structural changes, CPD also adopted body-worn cameras and retrained field officers on procedures for traffic stops and foot pursuits, the very circumstances that had led to Thomas's death. A federal monitor was appointed to oversee compliance with reform measures, and quarterly public reports were mandated for transparency. The city also engaged in outreach efforts to repair public trust. Town halls were hosted, youth mentorship programs funded, and a reconciliation process initiated between law enforcement and community leaders. Still, progress was slow. Many in the black community viewed the efforts as superficial, citing continued racial disparities in arrests and use of force incidents. Timothy Thomas's name became a symbol for reform, etched into the city's institutional memory. His family remained active in community work, with his mother, Angela Leisure, serving as a key voice on oversight panels and speaking at civic engagement forums. Despite reforms, she reminded audiences that her son's death had been preventable, and that accountability should not be mistaken for justice. More than 2 decades after the killing of Timothy C. Thomas, the events of April 2001 continue to cast a long shadow over Cincinnati and beyond. What began as a single, fatal encounter between a white police officer and an unarmed black teenager became a catalyst for systemic change, a benchmark case in police reform, and a cautionary tale of urban governance under strain. By 2010, the federal oversight of the Cincinnati Police Department had officially ended, with monitoring agencies declaring compliance with the terms of the collaborative agreement. National law enforcement experts cited the city as a model for reform-driven policing, pointing to reduced use of force incidents and improved civilian complaint processes. Community police relations, while still imperfect, had measurably improved by objective indicators such as resident surveys and arrest demographics. Yet, disparities persisted. Black residents continued to report disproportionate stops, searches, and citations. Economic inequality across neighborhoods, especially in Over the Rhine, remained entrenched. Gentrification brought new investment but also displaced long-term residents. For many in the city's black community, the structural problems that led to Thomas's death had been addressed in part, but not eradicated. In national discussions on police reform, Timothy Thomas's case is frequently referenced alongside other landmark incidents such as the 1991 beating of Rodney King and the 2014 killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. His death predated the widespread use of cell phone video or social media, but it revealed the long-standing dynamics of urban policing and racial profiling in America. Civil rights historians have highlighted the Cincinnati riots of 2001 as a turning point, the largest urban disturbance in the U.S. since the 1992 Los Angeles unrest. The response to the Thomas shooting laid early groundwork for concepts like community policing and independent civilian oversight that would later be proposed in dozens of other cities facing similar crises. Timothy Thomas is memorialized with a mural in Over the Rhine, not far from the alley where he was killed. Annual commemorations, led by community groups and his family, include calls for continued vigilance and civic engagement. His mother, Angela Leisure, remains a public speaker and advocate, reminding each new generation of her son's life and the changes his death inspired. Ultimately, the murder of Timothy C. Thomas stands not just as an individual tragedy, but as a defining moment in Cincinnati's civic evolution, a reminder that reform often emerges not through foresight, but through the demand that justice not be deferred.